Okay. A friend of mine said they noticed I posted a new video, so I decided to give this another try. Sorry for the extreme close-up. I need to get a camera mount. Anyway, I'm going to try to run through some of the psychological models I've been working on. I'm not an expert. I basically am very interested in models of the mind and brain which seem to work together well, which basically means not that I know a lot about how the brain is structured, but I know something about how science would want to structure our understanding of the brain. And as such, I'm trying to see the mind through the constraints of science in a sense, but still be able to include things like Jungian archetypes and a lot of other psychological phenomenon that happens in certain circles, you know, like talking to different parts of yourself. So there's a philosophical problem there. Yeah, maybe it's more of a philosophical issue than a scientific issue. But the issue is the idea of a homunculus, the idea that there is a person within us that is flipping switches and making controls, making things happen, and that, you know, maybe there's more than one of these. There's a whole family of systems, a family system dynamic. I think somebody has written a book about. And so you can talk to these different parts of yourself. But if there are selves within us we can talk to, and there is the self that is externalized towards other people, in which I'm aware of my self-identity, my ego, how does that work? Do all those other individuals have egos and all these other parts? Because if that is the case, then they would have egos within egos within egos, and it would become a reductio ad absurdum. So instead of seeing it like that, the model I came up with, so there's a few ways of looking at it, or a few parts, or a few contributions, perhaps is the right way of saying it. One is to consider what if our awareness is something like a screen on which the various aspects that make up the whole self are projected onto it. It's an analogy, of course, but it's the idea that what we are aware of, what our awareness finds, and from which we create our ego and our, I don't know if we create our ego, but we certainly create our self-image from. What if that all those parts are kind of like separate structures sending data to a single node, to a central node that is able to interpret all the data and correlate it all, and then feed back into all those systems from that correlation, to kind of, you know, bring everything together. I think that's what our awareness does, and for all I know, somebody else has already said that, and I'm way behind the times, but I haven't heard anybody say it, and so I'm saying it. So the analogy of that would be this idea of a screen and a set of projectors. I have no idea how many projectors. It seems to me that there would be more than just the left and right brain. There would also be, you know, you could almost say every central area of the brain, or every identified area of the brain, could have a projector. But it's not clear that they would all be projecting at the same time. That would not be useful. So these projectors either take turns or they overlay to create a more complex and nuanced and detailed image. Your senses project onto this. So you know, sound, sight, smell, taste, touch, and then you have your emotional overlay on that. And then you have, well, not only that, but arguably sensation is mapped. There's a system within our brain that hallucinates our perception, because it's got to take that raw data and kind of form it into something that the self can interact with, the screen can interact with. Now here's the thing, all that so far falls under this kind of idea of determinism, because what a deterministic scientist will sometimes say, or philosopher is more to the point, will say is, see, I can do a study that shows that you actually made that choice several seconds or milliseconds, whatever it is, before you were consciously aware of making that choice. Ergo, you don't have free will, which is ridiculous oversimplification, in my opinion. If you show the complicated way in which people make deliberations over time, become self-aware, model who they will be in the future, and then set out plans to do that, that is the whole self interacting with something, and the whole self is self-determining in that instance. Anyway, I digress. I've gone on at length in debates with other people about that, on Pleasure of Doubt's channel. Check them out. So sorry, lost my train of thought. The screen really lost my train of thought. Oh, determinism. Okay, so all that data is being projected over the screen, and a scientist could conceivably show all that data that comes to the screen as having been processed prior to the screen receiving it and making, being aware of the decision. However, what is interesting is that then what the screen receives, what our awareness receives, then has an influence on the rest of the system. So this, there's this kind of, I would consider it a misnomer, or at least we need to be very careful of how we are parsing these ideas. We tend to think the self, me, is this awareness, and the way I see myself, the way that awareness sees itself, if you will, the way it's defined itself. But that is an extremely narrow part of the self, the whole self, I mean. It is something like the self-aware self. I have defined myself thus far and no further. And that there may be mistakes and problems with, one's definition of oneself, one's self-image. But my argument here is that there is this incredible thing that happens in which all these systems come together, and we're aware of that, and yet that screen of awareness is also what tells those parts to do their job. So it's cyclical. It's all together. And arguably, we could talk about someone coming to know more and more of themselves through looking at, watching, paying attention to that feedback problem, pinging, testing, interpreting dreams, learning lots of mechanisms that help them come to know themselves. And so I guess maybe all that is kind of obvious from what I've said so far. But what might be interesting is, what if those back-end systems not necessarily develop awareness, self-awareness in that sense, but the data of self-awareness gets coded into them as well, so that the whole system becomes, it rhymes, if you will, or it's more loaded with self-aware software, something like that. Okay, that's, I think, all I have to say about that model, that independent individual model. And maybe that's enough for today since I'm almost home. So yeah, I hope that was interesting and helpful.